All right, in this unit, we're going to start talking about complex experimental designs. And obviously, we've already spent a good deal of the time this semester talking about experimental design in general and why it's important to be able to manipulate your independent variable to see how it can impact causally the outcomes on a dependent variable. A lot of times, it is not sufficient to answer your research question to just manipulate one independent variable. So that's what complex experimental designs are. When you are having more than those usual just one IV, one DV designs. So you might call a complex experimental design any type of experiment that has more than one independent variable, more than one dependent variable, or more than one of both. Usually, when people are talking about this, though, they're referring to having more than one independent variable, and that's what we're going to focus on in most of this video, in this set of videos. So remember that it just means more variables than we're used to talking about for the most part. So why would you want to make this so complicated? Why would you want to use more than one independent variable? I mean, as we've already seen, things already are difficult to keep consistent between experimental conditions. Why would you want to have more than one of these dimensions you're manipulating? Well, we've also talked about how laboratory experiments kind of simplify things quite a bit. And if you're trying to keep all things consistent except for one thing, we know that that leads to a lot of control, but it's also very artificial and there's not that much external validity. So if you really want to try to answer a question of how different variables are related, it's useful to think about how multiple independent variables might influence dependent variables. Most things are not determined by one variable or one factor, right? Most of the behaviors that we might be interested in as psychologists are probably affected by lots of different variables. So if you use more than one IV, that might help you approximate real world conditions a little bit better than if you just used one. The situations we encounter in real life are much more complicated than single IV laboratory experiments. Maybe more importantly is that not all variables, act the same on a dependent variable, depending on the presence of other variables, basically. Um, Stress might affect people differently if the task is important or unimportant, right? So you might want to manipulate an additional variable besides stress to see if it affects all task performance or maybe just things when it really matters, right? So it's easy to come up with these ideas about what we might call moderator variables, other independent variables that are going to affect how that relationship between your other IV and DV are going to look. So interactions, we can define that as when the effect of one independent variable differs depending on the level of a second independent variable. And if you are using a design with more than one independent variable and you are crossing all of these combinations of independent variable conditions together, this is what we would call a factorial design. When all the levels are crossed, you have all the possible combinations between your independent variable conditions. That's a factorial design. So the way we talk about factorial designs then, kind of needs a little bit of background. And the way you would describe this is by having a number of numbers, basically, looking like they're being multiplied together. So the simplest type of factorial design we might run into is 2 by 2. There are two numbers there, two twos, that indicates that there are two independent variables, and the twos themselves represent the number of conditions that we have. So we have two variables with two conditions being crossed together here. You can denote these designs though with obviously more complex designs. If you have 2 by 2 by 3, that would indicate that there are three independent variables because we have three numbers. The first has two conditions, the second also has two conditions, and the third has three conditions. The reason this is kind of useful is because it makes very explicit how many different discrete conditions or cells there are in these designs. If you multiply a 2 by 2 design together, then it's pretty easy to tell that that's going to have 4 cells or conditions, right? And I'll show you kind of how this works in a visual way in just a moment. If you would multiply out a 2 by 2 by 3 design, you would have 12 total conditions. So this kind of harkens back to how complex counterbalancing can be too, right? That the more you add, the more complex it gets relatively quickly. But again, that 2 by 2 by 3 design has 3 independent variables, so that one would have a little bit more complexity to it. Anyway. Another way to look at this, as promised, is to look at how these things would be plotted out together. Maybe let's say that variable A, I used the example of stress and task importance earlier. Let's say A1 is let's say A is stress, A1 is high stress, A2 is low stress, B is task importance, B1 is important, B2 is not important. So you have all these different conditions. In A1, B1, that would be high stress, high importance. A1, B2 would be high stress, low importance. A2, B1 would be low stress, high importance. And A2, B2 would be low stress, low importance. And it might be really useful to have all these different combinations so you know when stress matters and when task importance matters. And these things, again, are fully crossed. It's not as though you have any condition where it's just stress that's being manipulated or it's just task importance that's being manipulated. They're fully crossed together. So all the possible combinations are there. And if you have a design like this, then you'd be able to tell whether stress matters, whether task importance matters, and whether those effects depend on each other. That's the interaction part of it. So again, maybe stress only affects your performance when it's an important task. And we might be surprised to find it doesn't, matter when it's a less important task. But that would be a useful thing to figure out in a design like that. Another example, just because this is, kind of a wordy, complicated thing to get through, I just want to give you one more example to walk all the way. I mean, we're going to have a lot of examples in these few videos, but one more for now. Let's talk about an experiment where you're trying to figure out what affects people's recall for words. And your 2 independent variables are the type of word and the type of recall method they're using. So for the type of word, we have concrete words versus abstract words. Let's say for concrete words, we're talking about things like wall, fence, ball, street, water bottle, things that are, literal and concrete. For abstract, we might be talking about things like ephemeral, liberty, democracy, spirit, things like that that are abstract and not concrete. So we might have a reason to think that there's a difference between our memories for those. Maybe more importantly to memory, we might have an expectation that there are certain mnemonic devices or strategies that can help us remember things. The control method here, or the control condition rather, would be just trying your best to memorize a list of words. And you might remember something called the method of loci from your intro psych days. This is just the idea that you can sort of mentally place things along a path or a route you take or a map or something that helps you remember where things are. So, you can imagine like your grocery list on your walk from your where you live to your usual place you have classes or something, and you have milk on this corner, you have cheese by this house that you pass by, and placing those things mentally can help you remember what they are. But, there might be reason to think that that method doesn't work for everything, right? Maybe the method of loci only works for physical things that you can place along that route. And if you're thinking about more abstract things like democracy, that method might not work particularly well. So this is kind of an idealized set of results that you might get if you actually ran this experiment. So you have here the effect of word type in the control method and here you have the effect of word type for the method of loci. So each of these 4 points represents one cell of the study. This is concrete words in the control condition. This is concrete words in the loci condition. This is abstract words in the control condition, and this is abstract words in the loci condition. So just imagine that you only did an experiment about the method of loci using concrete words. If you looked at this and saw that concrete words are, difficult to pinpoint where these things are exactly sometimes. Let's say, again, that you only did the method of loci versus control with concrete words. So loci, the dotted line with concrete words, you remember 30 words versus 15 when you're not using that method. You might look at this and think, wow, the method of loci is an incredible mnemonic device that helps everybody all the time, right? Because you doubled the number of words basically that participants were remembering. But if you had had a different idea about what type of words to use and you just happen to use abstract words and you're over here, you might have thought, well, it only raises the number up from maybe 12 to 17. So maybe it works, but it doesn't seem to be doing all that much, right? So if you only did this with a certain type of list, you would have really lost some nuance in your understanding of what the method of loci is useful for. Here we can tell for concrete words where you could like literally in your mind place them along your path, there's a big effect. But when you're using abstract words, the effect is much smaller. So it's useful to think about what other variables might influence your primary independent variables that you're interested in. Like memory method is very influenced by the type of words that you use. Another example, just to give you another idea about how we might cross variables in factorial designs. We're going to use this when we get to the kind of the math about how these designs work, but I just want to explain it quick now. This is from a real study from Bazzini and Schaefer in the late 90s that was about when people find others attractive, essentially. So they brought participants into the lab and they read about a scenario with a stranger. And they measured the dating status of the participants. The participants were either people that were in an exclusive relationship or people that were not in an exclusive relationship. They also manipulated something about the type of scenario. So is the stranger they read about attracted to a friend of the participant, or is the stranger they read about attracted to the participant themselves? And then they measured the romantic interest that each participant had in that stranger. So these things are fully crossed in that there's exclusive daters reading about someone attracted to their friend, exclusive daters reading about someone attracted to themselves, non-exclusive daters reading about someone attracted to their friend, and non-exclusive daters reading about someone attracted to themselves. So we might expect, that people are going to be more attracted to someone that's attracted to them. That's a common finding in attraction relationships, that you like people that like you. There's a reciprocity there in relationships and attraction. But, maybe that's not true for everyone. Maybe that's moderated by the dating status, that people that are already taken, so to speak, or have a significant other, there might not be a difference there because they might, just not care as much about their attraction to people that aren't their significant other. So another example of how we might fully cross these different things. Another important thing about factorial designs is just to think about how we've already talked about some examples that are independent groups and repeated measures, right? Let's say you had every participant do the memory experiment where they were in every condition, where it was a fully within subjects design, where they did method of loci with concrete words, method of loci with abstract words, control with concrete words, and control with abstract words. You could do that with them in every condition. Or you could do that with them just doing one condition and randomly assigning participants to one and only one condition. Or there's a third option that I want to work up to. So think about t-tests that we've talked about in our inferential stats lessons, but you maybe have done with your own studies. For t-tests, you can have independent groups designs or repeated measures designs. In factorial designs, though, again, there is this third option. Independent groups designs, as you know, they have mutually exclusive groups of participants, different people in each condition. This needs a lot of participants, but you don't have to worry about all that troublesome counterbalancing that we've talked about previously. In repeated measures designs, you don't need as many participants, but counterbalancing matters, and you have to think about carryover effects even if you try to counterbalance and stuff like that. The third option that I've been alluding to is something we would call a mixed design. So this is when we might have, let's say, one independent variable that's independent groups and one independent variable that's repeated measures. So you might sometimes kind of be able to have a best of both worlds thing going on here, where it makes sense to do one variable independently and one variable in a repeated measures or within subjects fashion. So if you use this example for this experiment where you're trying to see if people are, have different moods, let's say, in different room colors, and it depends on how bright the lights are, you could do this where you had 20 different people in every cell, right? You'd need 80 people to do this study where you randomly assign them all to these different groups. Or if you did this completely within subjects, you'd have the same 20 people in each one of these cells. Or this third option of a mixed design, maybe you want to do room color in an independent groups way and level of lighting in a repeated measures way. So maybe you'd have everyone do you'd have 40 people perhaps assigned to well, I guess let's stick with 20, I guess. If you had 20 people assigned to yellow, and maybe they would do dim and bright lighting for a yellow room, and you'd have 20 people assigned to blue, and they would do dim and bright lighting for a blue room. But the yellow and blue groups are still mutually exclusive, but the people doing dim and bright are repeated across those different colors. So again, you could do this fully independent, fully repeated measures, or a mix of the two. Okay, in the next video, we're going to return to this romantic interest in a stranger example and kind of tease apart what the numbers here would actually mean for your results.